Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a deeply consequential and honestly often overlooked chapter of American history, the era of Native American boarding schools. Through the lens of our source material, we're going to unpack the government's policy of forced assimilation, examine the absolutely harrowing experiences of the children who lived through it, and then trace the long, difficult path toward Indigenous self-determination. So let's just jump right in. To really grasp the scale of what happened here, we have to start with this rather chilling ethos from 1892. It was articulated by Richard Henry Pratt, the superintendent of the Carlisle Indian School over in Pennsylvania. This quote instantly reveals the government's true, devastating objective at the time. You see, it wasn't just about education. It was about total cultural erasure. The policy was known as assimilation, and the fundamental idea was that everything native had to be systematically stripped away.
Section 1. The Policy of Assimilation, the Roots of the Indian Problem.
Looking back at the historical context, you can see exactly how the groundwork for these schools was laid. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, explorers like Lewis and Clark really publicized the West, which brought massive waves of settlers and entrepreneurs. And, well, that meant massive encroachment on indigenous lands. As native peoples were forced onto reservations, treaties like the 1868 treaty with the Navajo started actually requiring native children to attend American schools. By 1879, the Carlisle Indian Boarding School was founded at a former military site, and then the 1887 Dawes Act officially reinforced this super aggressive push for assimilation. It was essentially a declaration of war on indigenous culture.
Section 2. Inside the Boarding Schools, a War on Culture.
It's really jarring when you consider the stark contrast between these two worlds. These kids were taken from an environment that was deeply rooted in the natural world, family, prayer, and ceremony. But the very second they arrived at these schools, their entire reality flipped. Traditional clothes were immediately swapped out for military uniforms. Being close to family was completely discouraged just to maintain absolute control. They were forced into this isolated world, governed entirely by strict Anglo standards.
One of the most immediate and frankly traumatic changes was the mandatory haircut. As you hear in survivor accounts like this one, having their hair abruptly shorn wasn't just some basic grooming requirement, it was a deeply traumatizing act. In many Native traditions, long hair is a symbol of dignity, strength, and ancestral wisdom. So cutting it off was calculated. It was designed to sever the children's connection to their identity right from day one.
And building on that trauma, there was the devastating emotional toll of severe family separation. Survivor Kathleen Wood recalls the intense, heartbreaking loneliness of being left behind at the dormitories, especially around the holidays. The policy actively isolated these children, leaving a lasting psychological impact on students who are constantly wondering, if their families would ever come back for them. Now, an absolutely crucial point here is that compliance was enforced through extreme brutality. The sources document punishments that are honestly hard to even imagine. Schools like Haskell and Carlisle had actual confinement rooms, and researchers have even discovered child-sized handcuffs. Survivors recount being whipped with electrical cords, or being forced to kneel with dictionaries on their heads until they literally blacked out. And one of the absolute strictest rules of all, a total punishable ban on speaking any indigenous language. This extreme isolation and abuse pushed some kids to risk their own lives just to get back home. Take this devastating story from the Cheska boarding school in New Mexico, which details how 3 young brothers ran away into the freezing January winter. Now, while helicopters eventually did find them, the tragic reality is that all 3 boys suffered severe frostbite and actually had to have their legs amputated.
Section 3. Generational Trauma and Accomplishments, the Complex Aftermath.
Keep this number in your head for a second. 60,000. By 1973, that is the estimated number of Native American students who had been funneled into federally funded, non-reservation schools. The sheer massive scale of this system meant that its effects would ripple across almost every single Indigenous community in the country. And because of that immense scale, Indigenous advocates today point to something called boarding school syndrome. You see, the emotional, physical, and cultural abuse didn't just affect the students who attended. The trauma was actually passed down generationally. It fundamentally disrupted the Indigenous familial system, which directly contributes to ongoing struggles with poverty, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse in modern Native communities today.
But history is incredibly complex, and we see an unbelievable irony here.
The exact same native languages, like Navajo, that teachers physically punished children for speaking, were later weaponized for the benefit of the United States. During World War II, Native American code talkers used their indigenous languages to transmit vital, unbreakable messages that were absolutely crucial to the Allied victory. And despite the government's clear intentions to erase them, these students achieved incredible triumphs in the face of adversity. By forcing diverse tribes into single locations, the schools inadvertently forged powerful, unified intertribal relationships, creating a pan-Indian identity. These institutions also produced remarkable patriots like Ira Hayes, who helped raise the flag at Iwo Jima. Not to mention world-renowned artists like Alan Hauser and legendary Olympic medalists like Jim Thorpe and Billy Mills. Section 4. The Era of Self-Determination, a Shift in Policy and Power. Over several decades, we can trace how this power dynamic finally started to shift. As early as 1928, the Merriam Report officially documented the rampant abuses happening in these schools. By the 1960s and 70s, the civil rights movement ignited major indigenous activism. High-profile political events, like the occupations of Alcatraz and Wounded Knee, really forced the American public to confront this history head-on. Finally, in 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, which handed crucial control of local affairs and education right back to tribal communities.
Section 5. Reclaiming Native Identity, Education as Empowerment. A really prime example of this is the modern Santa Fe Indian School. Originally started back during the assimilation era, it is now exclusively owned and operated by the 19 pueblos of New Mexico. So instead of erasing culture, the curriculum actively integrates unique Native American values, history, and languages. As students today report, it operates as a sanctuary, a deeply supportive environment where Native youth feel genuinely cared for and connected to their spiritual roots.
When you put these two eras side by side, the monumental shift is undeniable. We have moved from an assimilation model built entirely on forced English, severe punishment, and deep shame to a true reclamation model. Today's tribal-run schools are focused on empowering Native youth, preserving ancestral languages, and embracing Indigenous history with profound pride. However, our source material makes it pretty clear that this fight isn't entirely over. Native advocates point out that communities are still battling the psychological impacts of the past in modern culture. They argue that offensive sports mascots, Hollywood caricatures, and persistent stereotypes in national media continue to perpetuate the totally false narrative that Indigenous people are savages or somehow primitive. For a lot of Native youth trying to maintain their cultural pride today, navigating these public stereotypes remains an incredibly painful ongoing challenge.
So as we wrap up this explainer, and remember the thousands of children who never returned home from those boarding schools, I want to leave you with one final thought. The sources remind us of Thomas Jefferson's idea that our democracy actually hinges on the quality of the education of the public. Knowing that, and looking back at this dark chapter, we really have to ask ourselves, how do we reckon with a history where education itself was fundamentally used as a weapon? Thank you so much for exploring this vital piece of history with me today.